There is a particular kind of rain that seems designed to find the gaps in a person's defenses. Not the dramatic kind, with thunder and announcement. The other kind. The quiet, persistent, soaking through kind, the kind that has been falling so long it has stopped being weather and started being simply the condition of the world. It was raining that way on the morning Daniel Forsyth sat in his usual booth at the Maple Street Diner, eating breakfast alone before his shift, the way he did most mornings since his wife passed 3 years ago and left him with a 6-year-old daughter and a kitchen full of recipes he was still learning to cook properly. The diner was the kind of place that had been exactly the same for 30 years and intended to keep it that way: red vinyl booths, a counter with stools bolted to the floor, the smell of coffee that had been perfected through decades of repetition. Daniel came most mornings before his shift at the lumber yard, because his daughter Ruthie went to her grandmother's for breakfast on weekdays, and the quiet booth by the window had become, in the 3 years since, something like his own private chapel, a place to sit with his coffee and his eggs and the particular silence that follows a loss that nobody talks about anymore because enough time has passed that they think you're past it. He was not entirely past it. But he was managing it, the way you manage things that don't go away but do, eventually, become carryable. He noticed the woman come in around the time his eggs arrived. She was soaked through, her hair plastered flat against her head, her cardigan torn at one shoulder in a way that looked recent rather than fashionable. She sat at the counter, 2 stools down from where the waitress usually stood, and she didn't order anything. She just sat, with her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing in particular, the specific stillness of someone who is trying very hard to hold themselves together in a public place. Daniel watched her for a moment. Then he watched the waitress approach her, and watched the brief exchange, too quiet for him to hear, but legible enough in its shape. The woman shaking her head. The waitress's face doing the careful, practiced thing that service industry faces do when they're delivering a policy they didn't write and don't necessarily agree with. The woman didn't have money. That much was clear from across the room. She started to get up. Daniel had been raised by a mother who fed people. Not professionally, she'd worked at the county clerk's office her whole career, but as a fundamental orientation toward the world. His mother's kitchen had never, in his memory, turned away anyone who was hungry, regardless of what that meant for the week's grocery budget, and Daniel had absorbed this the way children absorb the deepest lessons, not through instruction but through 20 years of simply watching it happen. He stood up before he'd fully decided to. "Wait," he said, and the woman at the counter turned, startled, her eyes red-rimmed and uncertain. "Come sit with me. I ordered too much. I do that sometimes." This was not true. Daniel ordered exactly what he ate, every morning, with the precision of a man who had learned to budget carefully on a lumberyard salary while raising a daughter alone. But it was the kind of lie that exists purely in service of letting someone keep their dignity, and the woman seemed to understand this, the way people in difficult circumstances often understand the architecture of a kindness even when they can't immediately accept it. She hesitated. Daniel didn't push. He simply gestured to the booth, sat back down, and returned his attention to his own plate, giving her the room to decide without an audience. She came and sat across from him. Her name was Eleanor Vance. She told him this quietly, after the waitress had brought her water and Daniel had ordered her a plate of her own, eggs and toast, the same as his, over her soft protest that she couldn't accept that, which Daniel met with the same gentle insistence his mother had used on him 1,000 times growing up. She had been driving from somewhere to somewhere, she was vague about both, in the way people are vague when the details are too raw to organize into a coherent narrative yet, when her car had broken down 4 miles back. She'd walked in the rain. Her phone was dead. Her wallet, along with most of what she'd been carrying, had been left behind in circumstances she didn't elaborate on and Daniel didn't ask about, because some things a person tells you when they're ready and not before. She cried while she ate, quietly, with the particular exhausted abandon of someone who has been holding something together for longer than was reasonable and has finally, in the safety of a warm booth and a kind stranger, let it go. Daniel didn't try to stop her or comfort her with words. He simply stayed present, ate his own breakfast at an unhurried pace, and let her have the space to fall apart without an audience demanding she explain herself. At one point, when her hands were shaking too much to manage her fork properly, he reached over without comment and helped guide a bite to her mouth, the way you'd help a child or an elderly parent, not from condescension but from the simple practical recognition that she needed the help, and asking her to acknowledge that need would have cost her something she didn't have left to spend. She let him. That told him something about how far down she was. He drove her to the auto shop after breakfast, on his way to work, and waited with her until the tow truck confirmed her car would be ready by evening. He gave her $40 from his wallet, most of what he had until payday, for a hotel room, and wrote his name and the lumber yard's number on a napkin in case she needed anything else. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said, standing in the rain outside the auto shop, her cardigan still damp, her composure mostly recovered. "You don't need to," Daniel said. "Just get where you're going safely." She looked at him for a long moment, the way people look at you when they're trying to memorize something important. "I will," she said. He went to work. He picked up Ruthie from his mother's that evening, made dinner, helped with homework, put his daughter to bed, and didn't think much more about it, not because it hadn't mattered, but because Daniel Forsyth was the kind of man for whom this sort of thing was simply what you did when the opportunity arose, not a story to be turned over and examined for its own significance. He did not see Eleanor Vance again. He did not expect to. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at his house. Heavy paper, a law firm's letterhead, the kind of envelope that makes a person's stomach drop slightly before they've even opened it, the way official-looking mail always does to people who have learned, over years of careful budgeting, to be wary of anything that looks expensive. He opened it standing in his kitchen, Ruthie doing homework at the table behind him. The letter was from a firm in the city, representing the estate of Eleanor Vance. Daniel read the first line 3 times before the words arranged themselves into something he could process. "We regret to inform you that Eleanor Vance passed away on the 14th of this month." He sat down slowly at the kitchen table, across from his daughter, who looked up at him with the immediate, uncomplicated concern of a 6-year-old who has learned to read her father's face for signs of trouble. "Daddy," she said. "It's all right, sweetheart," Daniel said, though his voice didn't sound entirely steady to his own ears. "Just a moment." He read on. Eleanor Vance, the letter explained, had been the founder and majority owner of Vance Textiles, a company Daniel had never heard of and that turned out, according to the letter's careful legal language, to be a significant manufacturing concern with holdings across 4 states. She had been driving alone that rainy morning, fleeing, though the letter didn't use this word. Daniel would learn the fuller story later, from her assistant, in a phone call that filled in what the legal language left out, a dangerous and controlling relationship that she had finally found the courage to leave, taking nothing with her but the clothes she was wearing and a resolve that had cost her everything she'd been carrying. She had been diagnosed, the assistant explained gently, with an aggressive cancer 18 months prior. She had known her time was limited. She had spent her last months quietly putting her affairs in order, ending the relationship that had been draining her of more than money, and trying to find, in whatever time remained, the kind of genuine human connection that her considerable wealth had made surprisingly difficult to locate. The morning at the diner, the assistant told him, had stayed with her. She had talked about it afterward, about the stranger who had given up his breakfast and his dignity-preserving lie and his $40 without knowing anything about her, without any expectation of return, simply because she was a person who needed kindness and he was a person willing to offer it. She had changed her will 11 days after that breakfast. The bequest was substantial. Not symbolic, not a gesture, substantial in the way that required Daniel to sit at his kitchen table for a long time after Ruthie had gone to bed, reading the letter again, trying to understand a number that didn't fit easily into the framework of a life built around lumber yard wages and careful grocery budgets. He called the law firm the following morning, his hands not entirely steady on the phone, and spoke with an attorney named Patricia Hale, who explained the details with the patient, careful clarity of someone accustomed to delivering large news to people who weren't prepared for it. She wrote a letter, Patricia said. For you, specifically. I can read it to you now, or send it, whichever you'd prefer. Now, Daniel said. Please. Patricia read it. Eleanor's voice, even secondhand, even read aloud by a stranger, came through with a clarity that made Daniel's throat tighten. Daniel, you didn't know who I was, and that's exactly why this matters. You gave me your breakfast and your dignity and $40 you clearly couldn't spare, and you asked nothing about who I was or why I needed it. In a life spent surrounded by people who wanted something from me, you wanted nothing. I have more money than I will ever need and considerably less time than I'd like, and I can think of no better use for what I'm leaving behind than to make sure it goes toward raising your daughter and building the kind of life that a man like you deserves. Please don't spend it trying to repay a debt. There isn't one. Just take care of Ruthie, and maybe, somewhere down the line, pass along the same kindness when you find someone in the rain who needs it. Daniel sat in his kitchen for a long time after the call ended, the morning light coming through the window the way it had been coming through the diner window that rainy day 3 weeks earlier, and he cried in the unhurried, unembarrassed way of a man who had spent 3 years learning that grief and gratitude often arrive wearing the same clothes. He didn't quit the lumber yard, not right away. He kept working there for another 8 months, partly out of habit and partly out of a genuine wariness about changing too much too fast, the careful instinct of someone who has learned not to trust sudden good fortune until it proves itself real. But he set up a trust for Ruthie's education that made her future, for the first time in her young life, entirely secure. He paid off his mother's mortgage without telling her until it was done. And he established, with the remainder, a fund, modest by Eleanor's standards but significant by his own, for stranded travelers and people in crisis passing through their county, administered quietly through the diner where it had all begun, with the owner's blessing and the waitress's enthusiastic participation. They called it, simply, the Rainy Day Fund. No fanfare, no plaques, no public recognition. Just a standing arrangement that anyone who walked into Maple Street Diner without the means to pay would be fed, no questions asked, the bill quietly settled from an account that never seemed to run dry. Ruthie grew up knowing the story, the way children grow up knowing the foundational stories of their families, not as a lesson delivered with instruction, but as simply the shape of who her father was. She knew about the woman in the rain. She knew about the breakfast given away. She knew, in the deepest way a child can know something, that her father was the kind of man who stood up before he'd fully decided to, because someone needed help and that was simply what you did. She asked him once, years later, when she was old enough to ask harder questions, whether he ever wished he'd known who Eleanor Vance was that morning, whether knowing would have changed anything about how he'd treated her. Daniel thought about this for a long moment. No, he said finally. If I'd known, I might have been performing kindness instead of just being kind. She needed someone to see her as a person who was cold and hungry and scared, not as someone whose name might matter. I'm glad I never knew. I think that's exactly why it mattered. Ruthie nodded slowly, filing this away the way children file away the things that will matter to them later, when they're old enough to need them. Outside, the rain was falling, the quiet persistent kind, and somewhere across town, the lights of Maple Street Diner glowed warm against the gray afternoon, the booth by the window waiting for whoever needed it next.